history has decided that colonisation was an evil. We think it is atrocious to put your hat on things like institutions and economic benefits to these people. Let's weigh that up against the harms that were perpetrated to these people. I don't know, things like genocide, things like mass slaughter, things like slavery, things like totally destroying a culture, a language, a belief system, and a way of life. And it wasn't over. It has enduring effects now on how these people live their lives. We think it is facetious and offensive to say that colonisation did more harm than good, and we think that discussion has no productive value in terms of moving these people on, and in terms of finding the solutions for the ills that are still plaguing these countries that experienced colonisation. Okay, in this speech, what I want to do is talk about, firstly, what kind of speech is going to result from this policy. Are we going to get more martyrs on soapboxes, or are we going to get the kind of productive things that we want? And secondly, what does this mean for the narrative of the countries that were colonised? Substantive will be into work. So what kind of speech will result? So what we heard from OO was that there will be more martyrs on soapboxes. We have a couple of responses. Firstly, we think a lot of these really offensive people currently operate in positions of power. Shinzo Abe's defense minister has said that the worst thing that happened to China was Japan being forced to move out of there and leaving them on their own to deal with that conflict themselves. We think when those people are in parliament and are in positions of power, it is very easy to get them, to criminalise them, to lock them up. We would stand for that. Secondly, though, we would say that for some people that operate on the margins, those that aren't out-and-out racists, and those that maybe think it was on the margins, good or bad, they're less likely to speak out in public because now they're scared of getting punished. They're scared of the criminal charges that we're going to bring against them. So we think net, we get less speech because there are fewer people in positions of power and people on the margins are not talking out on this atrocity. Thirdly, though, what we would say is we deny them access to the mediums of television, radio, newspapers, whatever. When you criminalise your speech, it's much harder to disseminate that information. What does that mean? It means it doesn't reach as many people. So you would actually literally have someone standing on a soapbox in the street, not on a soapbox on TV or on radio, where they actually have the capacity to reach hundreds and thousands of people because we have criminalised that speech. So we would say that the capacity for that to disseminate is actually very limited. Next he says, oh, but people will talk in private about these kind of things. Okay, sometimes it is hard to police things in private, but that doesn't mean that that's a reason to not try to do it. When we acknowledge that that is an atrocity and something that we should stand up for, we think principally we will criminalise that speech, we will get less of it, so even if there is some that remains in the private sphere, we think it is better to get it out of the public sphere, stop that dissemination, and help these countries move on. So what kind of speech do we think will actually result? Daniel started going through this in his narrative, but now I would like to extend on it more. So what we think happens is you shift the dialogue and the discourse on an international sphere from what was done and picking apart the facts of history to what we should do about it now, because now someone has admitted culpability, someone has said that it was their fault, and we think this means when you have allocated blame for the issues that now plague the country, it's much easier to move on in these negotiations and decide what you should actually do about it. So thank you. So what do we think is actually going to happen? We think Alan Kevin Rudd's apology to the Indigenous peoples of Australia, we're going to see that kind of thing coming from world leaders. We think this sends a really powerful message. They acknowledge the ills of the history, they acknowledge how important that history still is for those people, and that they should do something about it. We think then that kind of gesture will lead to more practical outcomes and practical solutions for the people that live within those countries. Things like directing more aid to those people. And I think it also acknowledges the weight of history and how important it is in those negotiations to know who did wrong when, and puts the emphasis on those benefits. We think that will lead to better outcomes for those people moving forward and dealing with that colonial legacy that still plagues them today. Closing.
Why are you privileging the victims of colonisation in comparison to the victims, say, of ethnic cleansing or slavery, who don't have the protection of law against saying something was good or bad?
Funnily enough, they kind of go hand in hand. So the colonisers, right, would go in and then take those people as slaves and ship them off to a new country. Those same ills plague those very people. So we think we can help those people as well, and we think that that's fine. So, moving on then to the second question, what does this mean for the narrative? Opening opposition wanted to say that in a marketplace of ideas, competing viewpoints will be equally heard and disseminated among the public. We think that this is really unfair and untrue for a couple of reasons. Because for a market to function, we think the first thing you need is everyone to be on an equal footing. everybody to have the same capacity to get that message heard by a variety of actors. Why doesn't that exist in the kind of countries we're talking about? We think it is markedly different when you have a black person in South Africa versus a white academic in South Africa, or even a white academic back in Britain or Belgium or wherever that actually colonised them, trying to discuss their narrative. We think that that white coloniser has so much more on their side. What kind of things? We think firstly, they have the weight of academic authority. They have the weight of many titles and postnominals after their name. That means people will stand up and listen to them when they say things like, it wasn't all that bad, we gave them economics, we gave them a court system. We think then people pay a lot more attention and clout to that kind of thing. Secondly, they often have institutional authority. So apart from being an academic, they could be someone that's in parliament, they could be someone that is renowned as being a really important leader in that country. That means that when someone tries to stand up and say, no, that is not the narrative, that is not what was perpetrated against my people, their message is drowned out and is lost in that kind of thing. We think that that means that marketplace of ideas is broken and cannot function when one group is constantly prioritised over another and one group's message will get out against another. We think a lot of these things are endemic because of the weight of history. You can't just change that institutional and academic authority. We think we have to ban it because the harms that it perpetrates are so great in terms of how that narrative is viewed for that country and in terms of how that country has to move on in the future. And the colonisers can just say, but we did more good than harm, so what is the point of us even trying to help them in the future? We think that that harms the people of that country. We would never stand up for that kind of speech. What we also think it does is results in a divide and a split in the community between the believers and the unbelievers about the goods and the harms of colonialisation. We think that is incredibly harmful for reuniting that community to fight against the ills that were perpetrated to them and to move on in the future. And we think that's what these communities really need to do in order to get change. Mr. Speaker, we think that it is time that we stop this egregious, offensive and factually untrue speech. We propose.